There's a place at the bottom of the world where the ocean has no land left to hide behind, where waves can grow taller than a 5-story building, where the wind doesn't just blow, it screams, and where hundreds of ships and thousands of men simply vanished, swallowed whole, with no wreckage, no bodies, no explanation. Sailors who survived it didn't brag about it. They went quiet. Some wept. Others said they'd rather have died than go back. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what waited for them down there, why it broke men who had already survived storms, battles, and shipwrecks elsewhere, and why an entire brotherhood of hardened seamen agreed on one thing. There was death, and then there was Cape Horn. The ocean with nowhere to hide. Cape Horn sits at the very southern tip of South America, the last scrap of rock before Antarctica, part of a small archipelago that belongs to Chile. On a map, it looks almost harmless, a little dot, a headland, but that dot happens to sit at nearly 56 degrees south latitude, and that number matters more than almost anything else in this story, because at that latitude, there is no land anywhere else on Earth to break the wind. Think about that for a second. If you're sailing at that latitude anywhere else in the southern hemisphere, the wind just keeps going. It circles the entire planet, uninterrupted, gathering speed and size the whole way around, because there's nothing, no continent, no island chain, nothing to slow it down. Sailors gave this endless belt of wind names that tell you everything you need to know. The roaring 40s, the furious 50s, and, once you're far enough south, the screaming 60s. Cape Horn sits right in the worst of that, and unlike almost anywhere else along that belt, here the wind finally hits something. It hits the tip of South America, and it gets funneled, compressed, and thrown into a gap between the continent and Antarctica, called the Drake Passage. That passage is roughly 800 kilometers wide, and through it flows the largest ocean current on the planet, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, carrying more water than all the world's rivers combined, many times over. Now take that volume of water, squeeze it through a relatively narrow gap, add wind that's been building strength for thousands of uninterrupted kilometers, and throw in a seafloor that rises sharply near the horn itself. What you get is not normal ocean swell. You get waves that stack on top of each other instead of rolling smoothly, waves that can reach heights of over 20 meters, with some documented rogue waves estimated even higher. Sailors called them greybeards, walls of water with foaming white crests that could appear seemingly from nowhere and swallow a ship's deck in seconds. And that's before you even get to the local weather. Tierra del Fuego, the island group Cape Horn belongs to, is mountainous and glaciated, and it produces something sailors feared almost as much as the big swells: sudden, violent downdrafts of wind called williwaws. These blast down from the mountains and glaciers with almost no warning, turning a merely dangerous sea into an unsurvivable one in the space of a few minutes. A ship could be sailing under a manageable amount of canvas one moment, and the next, a gust strong enough to snap masts would come screaming down off the ice with no warning at all. So you have hurricane-strength winds that never stop, currents from two oceans crashing together, waves that build into moving walls, sudden katabatic gusts off glaciers, icebergs drifting up from Antarctica into shipping lanes, and freezing temperatures that turned rigging into frozen rope and sails into sheets of ice. All of that at the exact spot ships needed to pass through if they wanted to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific or back again before a canal existed to let them cut through Panama instead. That's the geography. But geography alone doesn't explain the fear. To understand that, you need to understand what it actually meant to try to sail around this place, because for centuries, going around Cape Horn wasn't a shortcut. It was often the only option, and it could take weeks just to travel a few dozen miles. Coming up, we're going to look at one of the most harrowing survival stories in the history of the sea. A Royal Navy warship that was thrown against the rocks near Cape Horn, and what happened to its crew afterward, which is a story so extreme it's hard to believe it's real. But first, you need to understand why ships heading in one particular direction suffered so much more than ships heading the other way. The wrong way around. Here's the detail that changes everything. If you were sailing from the Pacific into the Atlantic, going around Cape Horn from west to east, the wind was usually behind you. It was still dangerous, still cold, still capable of killing you, but the wind and current were largely pushing you the direction you wanted to go. Sailors called this running your easting down, and while it was no picnic, ships could often get through in a matter of days. Going the other way was a completely different animal. Ships heading from the Atlantic into the Pacific, from east to west, had to fight directly into that endless belt of westerly wind. Every meter of progress had to be clawed out by tacking back and forth at sharp angles, essentially sailing a zigzag path directly into the teeth of the weather, gaining ground with agonizing slowness, sometimes losing it all again in a single bad night. Ships have documented cases of taking over 2 months to travel a stretch of ocean that, under calm conditions, might take a few days. Some ships tried for weeks, got beaten back so badly by storms that they lost more ground than they gained, and were forced to give up entirely, turning around and sailing the long way around the globe instead, all the way around Africa, just to avoid trying again. Now imagine you're a sailor on one of those ships. You've already been at sea for months. Your diet is salted meat, hardtack that's started to grow weevils, and whatever fresh water hasn't gone stagnant in the barrels. Then you reach the bottom of the world, and instead of a quick, dangerous crossing, you're told the ship is going to spend the next several weeks being hammered by storm after storm, with barely any rest, because someone has to be on deck at all times to manage the sails in gale force wind, in freezing spray, in darkness that can last 16, 17 hours a day depending on the season. Fingers going numb, rope tearing skin, waves breaking clean over the deck and sweeping men toward the rail. And it doesn't end after one storm. Another one is usually already forming behind it. This is why sailors who survived multiple trips around the Horn talked about it differently than they talked about other dangers at sea. A battle, a single terrible storm, a shipwreck, those things ended. Cape Horn, when the wind was against you, felt like it might never end. And that psychological weight, the sense of being trapped in an unrelenting punishment with no clear finish line, is a huge part of why the fear ran so deep. It wasn't just the danger of dying quickly, it was the dread of suffering slowly for weeks, with death only one mistake away the entire time. Now let's talk about one of the most extraordinary things that ever happened at Cape Horn, because it shows you exactly what could go wrong and just how far men would go to survive once it did. Wrecked at the bottom of the world. In 1740, a squadron of British Royal Navy ships set sail on a mission tied to a wider war with Spain. Among them was a ship called HMS Wager, a converted merchant vessel armed with cannons, carrying a crew of several hundred men, along with soldiers and supplies. The squadron's overall commander was a naval officer named George Anson, and the plan involved sailing around South America to strike at Spanish interests on the Pacific coast. They reached Cape Horn in 1741, and it could not have gone worse. They tried to round it during the depths of the southern winter, which meant the wind, the cold, and the seas were at their most extreme. The squadron was scattered by ferocious storms. Ships lost contact with each other. Disease had already been spreading through the crews, weakening men before the worst of the weather even hit. And HMS Wager, battered, undermanned because of illness, and struggling to control her sails in the endless gales, was driven off course, far south of where she should have been, and eventually wrecked on rocks near a small desolate island off the coast of Patagonia. That place is now known appropriately as Wager Island. What happened next is one of the most remarkable ordeals in maritime history. The survivors, roughly 140 men, made it ashore onto a barren, freezing, largely uninhabited island with almost no usable food source beyond shellfish, seabirds, and whatever supplies they'd managed to salvage from the wreck before it broke apart completely. There was no way to signal for rescue, no way to know if anyone was coming. And as the weeks turned into months, something almost as dangerous as the island itself began to take hold: the total breakdown of order among the survivors. The captain, David Cheap, tried to maintain naval discipline even though the ship itself no longer existed. Some of the crew felt that authority had effectively ended with the wreck, and tensions escalated until they turned violent. In one incident, the captain shot and killed a young officer named Henry Cozens after an altercation, an act that deeply divided the survivors and hardened the growing split between those loyal to the captain and those who no longer recognized his command. Eventually, a large group, led by the ship's gunner and a carpenter named John Bulkley, decided their only chance of survival was to modify one of the ship's salvaged boats, lengthening it and making it as seaworthy as they could, and attempt to sail back the way they'd come, through the Strait of Magellan and up the coast of South America, in the hope of reaching a Portuguese settlement in Brazil. This was, by any measure, an enormous gamble. They were attempting a journey of well over 2,000 kilometers in a small, overloaded, improvised vessel through some of the most dangerous waters on the planet, with barely any food. Many didn't survive that journey. Some died of starvation and exposure along the way. A number of men were simply left behind on desolate stretches of coastline when the group judged they were too weak to continue and the boat couldn't support their weight, a decision that still stands as one of the most haunting parts of the story. Of the group that set out, only a small fraction eventually staggered into Brazilian territory, emaciated and barely recognizable months later. Meanwhile, Captain Cheap and a much smaller group who had stayed loyal to him tried a different route, attempting to sail north along the coast to reach Spanish territory, since Spain, though an enemy in the wider war, was seen as their best chance of survival over freezing to death or starving on the island. Their journey was its own catalogue of suffering, involving encounters with the local indigenous population, some of whom helped guide and feed the desperate Englishmen, an act of generosity that likely saved several lives, even though the two groups had no shared language and every reason for mutual distrust. Cheap's group was eventually captured by Spanish authorities and, after years of captivity, several of them, including Cheap himself, eventually made it back to Britain. When the different survivor groups finally reached home, years apart from each other, they told wildly different, sometimes contradictory versions of what had happened on that island, and a formal court-martial was held. In the end, remarkably, given a shooting, allegations of abandonment, and behavior that in ordinary circumstances would have ended careers or worse, the court largely excused the survivors, essentially ruling that a shipwreck erased the normal chain of command and its obligations. Both Bulkley and Cheap were able to publish their own accounts of what happened, and their conflicting versions became widely read at the time, giving the British public one of its first real, unfiltered glimpses into what Cape Horn could do to men, not through storms alone, but through the slow, grinding collapse of order and hope once the ship itself was gone. What's chilling about the Wager story isn't just the shipwreck. Ships wrecked constantly in that era. What's chilling is what happened afterward, how quickly a group of trained, disciplined naval officers and sailors turned on each other once stranded, how survival began to matter more than rank, more than law, more than the bonds that had held them together for years at sea. Cape Horn didn't just wreck their ship, it stripped away the structure that had kept over 100 men functioning as a single unit, and what was left underneath wasn't pretty. That's one case, but the Wager wasn't unique, it was just unusually well documented. So let's talk numbers, because the scale of what Cape Horn did to sailing ships over the centuries is almost hard to comprehend. 800 ships, 10,000 men. Historians who've studied Cape Horn shipping records generally agree that between the early 1600s, when European sailors first began deliberately using this route, and the early 20th century, when it was largely replaced by the Panama Canal, several hundred ships were lost trying to round the Horn, with commonly cited estimates putting the number at around 800 vessels, and the death toll somewhere in the range of 10,000 sailors. These numbers come with some uncertainty, since record-keeping from earlier centuries wasn't always thorough, and not every lost ship was definitively tied to Cape Horn weather specifically. But even the more conservative estimates paint the same picture. This single stretch of ocean claimed an extraordinary number of ships and lives concentrated in one of the most remote, least habited parts of the planet, far from any port that could send help. For context on why this route mattered so much, despite the danger, you have to remember that before 1914, when the Panama Canal opened, there was no shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific for large ships. If you wanted to move goods, people, or a navy from one ocean to the other, your options were essentially the Strait of Magellan, which was narrow, difficult to navigate, and had its own dangerous currents and unpredictable winds, funneled by high terrain on either side, or the open ocean route around Cape Horn itself, which was more exposed to weather but avoided the tightest, most current-choked parts of the strait. This mattered enormously during specific periods of history. During the mid-1800s gold rush in California, ships from the east coast of the United States and from Europe faced a choice: an agonizingly slow overland crossing of an entire continent, or a sea voyage of many months that took them all the way around South America via Cape Horn. Thousands chose the sea route, and shipping companies built faster and faster vessels, the clipper ships specifically to shave time off that journey, racing each other to be first into San Francisco Bay with gold-seeking passengers or valuable cargo. Later in the 19th century, the trade routes shifted again. Ships were now hauling massive cargoes of wool from Australia to Europe and nitrate used in fertilizer and explosives from Chile back to European ports. Both of these trades depended almost entirely on Cape Horn, and this era produced some of the largest and most technically advanced sailing ships ever built. Enormous steel-hulled vessels with 4 or 5 masts carrying acres of canvas, built specifically to survive conditions that would tear apart older wooden ships. And still, Cape Horn took its toll on them. One of the most harrowing documented voyages from this era involved a ship called the British Isles, a large steel sailing vessel which in 1905 attempted to round Cape Horn from east to west and got trapped in a brutal sequence of storms that lasted roughly 70 days. 70 days fighting to make headway against wind and sea that refused to let up. During that ordeal, several crew members were killed by falling from the rigging or being swept overboard by waves crashing across the deck. Others suffered severe frostbite in temperatures that turned wet rope and clothing into ice within minutes. And by the time the ship finally broke through into calmer water, the survivors were physically and mentally shattered. Accounts from that voyage describe a crew that had essentially stopped functioning as normal human beings by the end, moving on pure exhausted instinct, having gone weeks with almost no proper sleep, constantly soaked, constantly cold, constantly one wrong step away from being thrown into freezing water from which nobody could be rescued in time. And that's the detail that made Cape Horn so uniquely terrifying compared to other dangers sailors faced. If you went overboard almost anywhere else in the world, there was at least a chance, however slim, of rescue, of surviving in the water long enough for someone to reach you. At Cape Horn, the water temperature alone could bring on incapacitation within minutes, combined with towering waves that made spotting a person in the water nearly impossible, and wind so strong that turning a large sailing ship around to attempt a rescue could take longer than a man could survive in that cold. Going overboard near Cape Horn was, in practical terms, almost always a death sentence, and every sailor on deck knew it every single time they clipped onto a line or climbed out onto a yardarm to fight with a frozen iron-hard sail 70 or 80 feet above a heaving deck, in the dark, in the cold, in the wind. There's a particularly telling passage from Richard Henry Dana Jr., an American sailor who wrote about his own experiences at sea in the 1830s in a memoir that became one of the most widely read first-hand accounts of a sailor's life at the time. Dana described the misery of working the sails during a Cape Horn crossing in painstaking detail. The numbness in the hands, the way frozen canvas would tear at exposed skin, the sheer physical toll of hours spent aloft in temperatures that made every task exponentially harder than it would be in warmer waters. His account, along with many others from that era, helped give people back on land, people who had never been to sea, a real sense of just how different this stretch of ocean was from anywhere else a sailing ship might go. Earrings, tattoos, and dead men's birds. Now, here's something that tells you almost everything about how deeply this fear was ingrained in sailing culture. The traditions and superstitions that grew up specifically around surviving Cape Horn. Sailors have always been a superstitious group, but the rituals connected to rounding the horn were on another level, because they weren't just superstition for its own sake, they were a way of marking survival, of proving you'd been through something that most people back on land could never understand. A sailor who had successfully rounded Cape Horn earned the right to wear a gold hoop earring, traditionally in the ear that had faced the horn during the crossing. If a sailor had rounded both Cape Horn and the other Great Southern Cape, the Cape of Good Hope at the tip of Africa, he could wear an earring in both ears. It sounds like a small thing, but at the time it functioned almost like a medal, a visible sign to anyone who saw it that this person had survived something most sailors dreaded more than almost anything else at sea. Tattoos worked the same way. A fully rigged sailing ship tattooed on the body became closely associated with having rounded Cape Horn, a permanent mark that told other sailors, without a word needing to be spoken, exactly what this person had lived through. There was also a widespread belief connecting the albatross, the massive seabird commonly seen gliding over the Southern Ocean, to the souls of sailors who had died attempting the crossing. Killing an albatross was considered to bring terrible luck, a superstition immortalized in a famous poem from the era, and sailors who had successfully rounded the horn sometimes got an albatross tattooed on their body as well, a symbol of having survived the place where so many of those birds seemed to endlessly circle. There was even a set of informal privileges that came with having rounded the horn under sail. Men who had done it were, by tradition, entitled to certain small rights among fellow sailors, like being permitted to keep one foot up on the dinner table during a meal. A strange little custom, but one that meant something because it was earned. Decades later, in the 20th century, this culture became formalized when surviving Cape Horn sailors from the old sailing ship era organized themselves into an official association, open only to those who had rounded the horn on a working commercial sailing ship without the aid of an engine. Membership required proof, and as the age of commercial sail gave way entirely to steam and diesel power, the number of people who could ever qualify for that membership became fixed, a shrinking, aging group of men who had shared something almost nobody else on Earth would ever experience again. That detail alone tells you how seriously this was taken. This wasn't just a hard part of a sailor's job. It was treated by sailors themselves as one of the defining experiences of a life at sea, worthy of its own permanent traditions, its own rituals, its own exclusive brotherhood, alone against the horn. So with all of this fear, all of these deaths, all of this dread built up over centuries, you might wonder who would willingly choose to sail there, especially alone. And that brings us to some of the most astonishing individual stories connected to Cape Horn, because a small number of sailors didn't just survive the horn as part of a crew. They went through it completely alone. The first person to sail solo around the entire world was an American sea captain named Joshua Slocum, who set off in 1895 in a small rebuilt fishing boat and spent just over 3 years circling the globe by himself. His route took him through the Strait of Magellan rather than directly around Cape Horn, but even that route exposed him to the same brutal weather systems, the same relentless westerly winds, and he wrote afterward about nights spent fighting the helm alone, unable to sleep for what felt like days at a stretch, tacking back and forth against storms that seemed determined to push him back the way he'd come. Slocum's account of that stretch of his voyage remains one of the most vivid first-hand descriptions of what it was like to face that part of the world with no crew at all, Nobody to relieve you at the helm, nobody to help if something went wrong. Just you, a small wooden boat, and an ocean that had already claimed thousands of far larger, far better crewed ships. Decades later, in the early 1940s, an Argentine sailor named Vito Dumas took on an even more extreme version of that same challenge. In the middle of the Second World War, with much of the world's shipping either militarized or avoiding the open ocean entirely, Dumas set out alone in a small sailboat to circle the globe via the three great southern capes, the Cape of Good Hope, Cape Leeuwin off Australia, and Cape Horn, staying almost entirely within the roaring 40s and furious 50s the whole way, deliberately choosing the most dangerous latitudes on Earth because that was simply the fastest route. At one point during his voyage, he dislocated his shoulder in rough conditions, and with no one to help him, he set the joint back into place himself, alone in the middle of the Southern Ocean, then continued sailing. When he eventually rounded Cape Horn, he did so in dreadful weather, cold, exhausted, and completely isolated, months into a voyage most people would never have attempted, even with a full crew and modern equipment. These solitary voyages tell you something important about Cape Horn's reputation. Sailing around it with a full crew on a well-built ship was already considered one of the most dangerous things a person could do at sea. Doing it entirely alone, with no one to take the helm when your body finally gave out, was considered by many at the time to be bordering on suicidal in the plain, literal sense of putting your life on a knife's edge. And yet, a handful of sailors did it anyway, driven by a mixture of ambition, obsession, and the simple desire to prove that it could be done. The ship that vanished. Not every solo attempt ended well, and one story from the modern era captures just how much psychological pressure this place and the ambition to conquer it could put on a person. In 1968, a race was organized to find the first person to sail single-handed and non-stop around the entire world, a route that necessarily included Cape Horn. Several experienced sailors entered, and eventually one of them, Robin Knox Johnston, became the only competitor to complete the full course, arriving home after more than 300 days alone at sea, having rounded Cape Horn and the other Great Capes without a single stop anywhere in the world. But another entrant in that same race, a relatively inexperienced sailor named Donald Crowhurst, found himself in a boat that wasn't truly ready for the voyage, fell dangerously behind schedule, and, rather than admit failure, began falsifying his logbooks to make it appear he was somewhere he wasn't, all while drifting in the South Atlantic instead of actually attempting the Southern Ocean route at all. Weeks later, his boat was found adrift, empty, with logbooks revealing a mind that had clearly deteriorated under the isolation and the pressure of the deception. Crowhurst himself was never found. His story remains one of the most sobering illustrations of what the psychological weight of this ocean and the reputation attached to conquering it could do to a person, even without a single storm needing to sink the boat at all. There's also a piece of Cape Horn folklore worth mentioning carefully, because it shows just how much myth grew up around this place alongside the very real history. A ship called the Marlborough left New Zealand in the late 1800s, bound for England via Cape Horn, and was never heard from again, simply logged as lost at sea like so many others. Decades later, a story began circulating that another vessel had supposedly encountered the Marlborough still afloat, drifting, its sails rotted and its crew reduced to skeletons still at their stations, as though frozen in the exact moment disaster struck. It's a haunting image, and it's been retold many times over the past century. But it's important to be honest here. There's no reliable documentation that this encounter ever actually happened, and most maritime historians consider it a legend that grew out of the very real, very common tragedy of ships simply vanishing near the Horn with no survivors and no wreckage ever found. A mystery that people, then and now, have always wanted to fill in with a story, even an invented one. And that need to fill in the silence with something tells you a lot about why Cape Horn's reputation grew the way it did. When a ship went down in a storm somewhere else, There was often wreckage, survivors, some kind of evidence that let people back home understand roughly what had happened. Near Cape Horn, ships could simply disappear entirely, swallowed by weather so violent it left nothing behind to explain itself. No distress call in an era before reliable long-range radio, no wreckage that ever washed ashore, nothing but an overdue ship and a waiting family that eventually had to accept there would never be an answer. That kind of total, silent disappearance is arguably even more unsettling than a documented disaster, because it leaves nothing for the imagination to do except assume the absolute worst. And after centuries of it happening again and again, that assumption became baked into how every sailor thought about this stretch of water before they ever set sail toward it themselves. The end of the old route. By the early 20th century, the need to face any of this at all began to fade. Construction on the Panama Canal, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific through a narrow, engineered and heavily protected passage across Central America, finished in 1914, and almost overnight, the vast majority of commercial shipping that had once been forced south around Cape Horn simply stopped going there. Why would a ship's owner risk weeks of brutal weather, a real chance of losing the ship entirely, and a crew that might refuse to sign on for a known Cape Horn voyage, when a canal now offered a faster, calmer, dramatically safer alternative? Commercial traffic around the Horn collapsed within just a few years, and by the 1930s and 1940s, only a small number of large cargo sailing ships carrying bulk goods like grain from Australia were still making the journey the old way, in what became known as the final great era of commercial sail. A last generation of massive steel windjammers manned by crews who were, by then, among the very last people on Earth who would ever have to face what centuries of sailors before them had feared. Today, Cape Horn is no longer the forced gauntlet it once was. Modern ships have engines powerful enough to push through weather that would have doomed a sailing vessel. Accurate weather forecasting that lets captains time their passage to avoid the very worst systems, and satellite communication that means a ship in distress isn't simply alone and silent the way it once was. And yet, even now, with all of that technology, Cape Horn still commands enormous respect from anyone who sails it, still produces waves and wind capable of damaging or sinking modern vessels, and still draws small numbers of sailing enthusiasts and adventurers who deliberately choose to round it under sail, seeking out the exact same test that broke and killed so many people who came before them, purely for the sake of being able to say they've done it. Why it was worse than death. So why did sailors fear Cape Horn more than death itself? Because for centuries, going there wasn't a choice between danger and safety. It was often the only route available, which meant sailors couldn't simply avoid the risk. They had to walk directly into it, again and again, voyage after voyage, fully aware of exactly what waited for them, aware of the ships that had gone before and never come back, aware of the weeks of exhausting, freezing, unrelenting labor that awaited them even in a best-case crossing. Death at sea elsewhere could be sudden, a single storm, a single battle, a single accident. Cape Horn offered something worse, the near certainty of prolonged suffering, physical and psychological, with death as only one of several possible outcomes, alongside frostbite, exhaustion, the slow unraveling of a crew's discipline and sanity, and in the case of the wager, the complete collapse of the order that normally held a group of desperate men together. It wasn't just a place where you might die. It was a place where you were guaranteed to suffer first, for as long as the wind decided to keep you there, and that guarantee, repeated across generations of sailors who all heard the same stories before they ever left port themselves, is exactly what built a reputation strong enough to make hardened seafaring men speak of a stretch of ocean the way you'd speak of something worse than death itself. If you found this as fascinating as we did, do us a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow. And if you want more deep dives into the darkest, strangest, most extraordinary corners of maritime history, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.